Thank you for joining today's webinar on AI and digital advertising. So as I'm sure you're all aware, digital advertising underpins the current business model of the internet and continues to be a booming industry. But as AI-powered advertising grows more pervasive and sophisticated, many organizations across the world have encountered ethical issues resulting from the use of AI. A new report authored by Harriet Kingaby from the Conscious Advertising Network looks into the rise and potential harms of AI-powered advertising and argues that more needs to be done to protect consumers from things like excessive data collection, discrimination, scams, and manipulation. And we're delighted to actually have Harriet with us today, who will present the findings of her report, many of which echo and build on the work being carried out by WFA's Data Ethics Board, including the recently published Data Ethics Guide, but also the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. And we'll open up a discussion about how advertisers, civil society, industry, and policymakers can work together to ensure a sustainable future. So without much further ado, I'll pass over to you, Harriet. Just before we start, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A after the presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to just drop them in the chat box, and we'll make sure that they get answered during the Q&A session.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gabby. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to try and share my screen and present to you a little bit about the report that we've been talking about. I hope everyone can see that. If not, please do let us know in the chat function. So yes, I am both the chair of the Conscious Advertising Network and a Mozilla fellow. And the report that I have literally just published is all looking at AI advertising and how, from a consumer perspective, these technologies are affecting their use of the web and their expectations and their relationships with brands. As Gabby said, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A after this presentation. So I'm going to start and give you a little bit of an introduction as to where this report has come from and the kind of methodology that actually was used to get to the endpoints. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the recommendations that came out of the report, and then we're going to have a chance for you to ask some questions. If you do have questions that occur to you as we're going through, please do feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. So a little bit about me. About 3 years ago, I organised a conference around ethics in technology with some colleagues of mine, and there I met someone called Jake Dubbins, who is my co-chair of the Conscious Advertising Network. And I had just come off the back of a political campaign where I was working on how we got young people involved in the Brexit referendum. And I had become concerned around the information environment that we were attempting to talk to people in was becoming seriously problematic. It was causing polarization. We were seeing filter bubbles, and increasingly it was making our campaigning and talking to people about particular issues very, very difficult. Jake, on the other hand, had just finished some work around hate speech, and a friend of his had been assaulted in a racist attack, and he had also become concerned around the way that advertising, the way that our online environment was actually polarizing and changing the discourse both in the UK and globally. And from those discussions that came out of this event, the Conscious Advertising Network was born. We've been going for about 3 years now. And we've made a lot of progress from those first conversations. This piece of work was born out of something called a Mozilla Fellowship. So I've been working on this exclusively for the last year, and funded by Mozilla and placed with an organisation called Consumers International. And the challenge that we set ourselves for this fellowship was actually, how do we collectively make better decisions about integrating artificial intelligence into advertising, so we minimize the good, we maximize the good and minimize the bad. And the reason that this piece of work felt very, very important is that actually artificial intelligence is prolific in its use in advertising at the moment, and it is also growing hugely. Now, for many marketers, this AI still represents a kind of overhyped technology and something that perhaps they feel like they should be using. But as it grows and becomes more mainstream, we're going to start to see applications increase even more. But the issue being that actually most organizations that have embedded artificial intelligence to date in some way have already encountered ethical issues. And we felt that this was really important to interrogate, because as far in our work in the Conscious Advertising Network, we and the work and the effects that we've seen from embedding technology into advertising has already thrown up some interesting and often concerning kind of side effects and results. And the WFA president Rajamana puts it very, very well. We are at a critical juncture right now. We are already seeing moves to regulate artificial intelligence. The EU is currently discussing a ban on targeted advertising, and issues, films such as Netflix's Social Dilemma are causing consumers and the public to question the role of advertising in their lives. So right now is a very, very good time to be having these conversations and to be interrogating the way we both implement and use technology. And we see this in the initiatives that are out there today. GARM's Principles for Partnership are excellent example here of looking at how across the advertising ecosystem we can build trust and improve user experience, for example. So this was the starting point for this piece of work, to review what was already out there and already happening. As we mentioned, the EC has just released a white paper, and we just had a consultation around their white paper on AI and how they embed it. And actually, what's being proposed at the moment won't affect advertising. It will actually focus most on high-risk technologies, as it calls it, of which advertising isn't necessarily one. However, we know from the way that our shift from analog advertising to programmatic and other forms of digital advertising has changed the way that the internet and the web has developed. We know that advertising advertising technology has the power to change our online information environments in ways that we perhaps couldn't predict. So again, when starting this work, we felt that actually not considering the effects of advertising could be quite a serious omission. And so the organisation that I was embedded with, Consumers International, have actually created a trust framework from a consumer perspective. So not just thinking about the needs of the advertising industry or the needs of particular groups. This one focused on consumers. And as consumers are the ones that we as advertisers are trying to build up the trust with, this felt like a good place to start. And this digital trust framework is pretty holistic. It takes into account everything from it doesn't just take into account advertising. It also takes into account trust in the digital environment in which advertising appears. Not only that, but it takes both human rights and kind of consumer protection law and embeds them throughout, including environmental protection, which was an area of trust that was missing in some of the work that we reviewed. And we started to look at this. AI is a pretty loose term to describe a whole suite of applications and technologies. So the ones that we focused on were machine learning, because machine learning is fairly consistently used already in advertising. We can have a look at the effects that that's having today. And we also looked at emotional recognition. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, it is essentially using AI to read the emotions on your face and make judgments about what you might be feeling. And this is a little bit further out. It's not prolifically used in advertising yet, but it gives us an opportunity to look at what happens, kind of 3 to 5 years out in terms of impacts when we embed new technology. And the report itself, essentially what we did is we audited these technologies and various use cases of these technologies through that 12-point consumer trust framework that I showed you. And we said, look, do these use cases actually stack up? And are they going to, if we continue using technology in this way, are we going to rebuild trust using this trust framework as a starting point? And actually we found 7 key harms, we found 7 key harms, some consumer-facing harms, and some what we called citizen harms. And the consumer harms, some of which will be fairly recognizable to many of you, things like excessive data collection. Using AI is necessarily data hungry, and therefore, and the scope of this report was global. And what we found was in areas where there is data protection legislation, we have some very, very different behaviours to in countries and regions where where we are yet to get data protection legislation kind of passed. And this really created a 2-tier system and created some of the less trustworthy behaviours, I think, that we found were in areas that didn't have this legislation in place or where it wasn't being effectively enforced. Secondly, discrimination and restriction of choice. Algorithmic decision-making around what advertising a consumer can see is, by its very, very nature, selective. And this is fine when we're talking about selecting which kind of chocolate bar I might want to purchase, or a fashion type purchase. But it becomes problematic when we consider housing, education, and jobs, and the algorithmic decision-making that goes into showing people what housing, education, and jobs should be or should be tailored and available to them. Also, with the discrimination restriction of choice, we explored this idea that actually advertising is as Gabby said straight up in the introduction, advertising is a key funder of the internet, all the content on the internet, cat videos through to quality journalism. And actually that advertising money and the availability of that cash for content creators is not evenly distributed. We found examples of, for example, advertising money not reaching, being much more available for those who spoke English and European languages than those that spoke kind of smaller scale languages, for example. And we also found incidences of advertising money not reaching minority media or community media. And we'll talk about that in a second. The third one was lack of consumer agency. So I, as a consumer, cannot choose which ad tech vendors are collecting and processing my data. And that is, and that from a consumer choice perspective can be problematic. So let's just look at some case studies. So quickly, the case study now for discrimination restriction of choice is this, was the use of block lists earlier on this year. And basically what's happened is brands have included coronavirus-related block lists, coronavirus-related words in their block lists, and advertising is not reaching hard news at a time when we need it the most. It also has led to things like the defunding of LGBTQ media, where we add kind of words related to LGBTQ communities to our block lists. And you might be saying this is just algorithmic decision making. It's not AI per se, but this problem exists as many of these special categories have been used in code in AI related brand safety vendors, for example. So we're seeing already that certain communities and certain sections of certain content creators are being cut out through being automatically kind of excluded. And what might this look like in the future? Well, this is an example of 2 patents from Motorola and Symbol Technologies, which actually have these patents are for smart televisions, and they would effectively allow the makers of the televisions to turn on the web camera, collect facial data from the family who owns that television to allow them to essentially identify who was watching, and then read their emotions to see, actually to tailor ads and say, well, this person's here and we know they like X and they're feeling this, so we should show them this ad. Now, this obviously, arguably, this would allow us to tailor TV ads, but there was a high level of discomfort when we tested this in workshops between consumers and digital rights groups who felt that this was invasive. The next 2 harms found were an increase in online scams. So increasingly effective targeting technology could identify those who are most vulnerable to scams and more effectively tailor and target them with harmful content. Or one interviewee pointed out that deepfake technology is already being used to assist in online scams as well. So we felt that there was that actually this technology could open up opportunities for online scams to become much more sophisticated. And this one's quite a chunky one: harm to vulnerable people. If you look globally, 50% of the world's population are not yet online. And when they do come online, they are going to be faced with sophisticated advertising technology and personalization of information and a whole suite of kind of AI-based personalization technologies, which is going to make things difficult for them if we don't have effective digital literacy programs in place and we don't have effective online stewardship of and protection of these people. Also, at the moment, we have incidences where advertising money is creating a funding model for hate speech and misinformation online, and that is existing technology being gamed in order to make that happen. So, what does that look like today? This is an example in the States where location technology was collected by an organization, Mobile Wallet, ostensibly for advertising purposes, and was in fact passed on to state actors. And there are other examples of this happening in Latin America as well. And then this one from a little bit further in the future. So emotional recognition startups are actually coming online and actually being based on junk science that suggests that you can tell people's personality types or even their sexuality from their facial features. And this is debunked technology that was got rid of about 150 years ago from law enforcement because it's simply not based on fact. And yet we're seeing startups that are kind of coming out and repackaging this. And this was just an example. This was an example from the British press this year, and some of the digital rights groups kind of kicking back on that. The final two harms that we found were what we call citizen harms. First of which was environmental impact. The use of training and implementing an AI is a hugely energy efficient and a hugely energy intensive kind of process, which requires quite a lot of processing power and therefore energy. And also the huge amount of processing power needed to power the online advertising system in general, particularly when you take into account things like ad fraud, is high. And that is something that we felt needed to be addressed. And finally, hate speech. So as I mentioned before, not only does online advertising, has the UN highlighted that online advertising has created a funding model for hate speech and misinformation, but we saw evidence of that being gamed and enhanced by actors who knew how to do it well. So a quick example. The global IT sector has an enormous carbon footprint, and we got a very clever person from Manifesto to do some maths for us, and that top statistic is very, very broad in terms of the energy consumption of online advertising globally, but I believe it's actually equivalent to around the CO2 equivalent of a country like Ghana, if you took the median, kind of measure there. So, given all of this, given what we've looked at, what does this actually mean for advertisers? Well, there were several needs that were kind of identified, broad needs. The first of which being a much more proactive approach needed to kind of harm description, prediction, detection, and mitigation. So what's happened to date, we felt, was that actually once harms have started to be created, then there has been dialogue with civil society, or then there has been dialogue with digital rights groups who've raised these issues. And we've taken this very reactive approach to actually trying to fix some of them. We're also doing a lot of this without standardized definitions of what some of these things mean. So in our work in a conscious advertising network, for example, we have taken the UN's definitions of hate speech, for example, as the definitions that we have said. But often what we found from interviews and surveys was that there's not necessarily accepted definitions of some of these harms. And I know that GARM has just done some fantastic work with their brand suitability framework to try and crack this problem. But not only do we need to get proactive in trying to spot these harms before they predict them, before they occur, or spot them as they're occurring, but then we also need coordinated responses to mitigating them, so that we're not creating financial or kind of financial penalties or things like that for organizations that do. Second need was that actually we need collective solutions that respect human rights, environment, and ethics. To date, what we have seen is actually sometimes the problem definition and the solution definition has been taken by the advertising community, and we've tried to solve the problem ourselves. And this is actually quite limiting because, for example, as a group, we have incredible expertise around kind of what the most creative way to impart a message is, but perhaps human rights, detailed human rights expertise is just not our thing. But there are organisations out there for whom this is this is their area of expertise and who are working on these issues. And what we found was a lot of antagonistic relationships and not necessarily enough collaboration and working together. And then the third need was this idea of challenging tech solutionism. So it's very tempting. Like, these technologies are incredible. They are so interesting. They create new opportunities for creativity, for efficiency, etc. But there is a tendency for us to default to these technologies when there is a problem to be solved. And in fact, these technologies are not yet perfect. They're not yet always good enough to fix the problem. And in fact, sometimes they create problems that don't need to be fixed at all. So, for example, in some areas where it would have been far more efficient and far more effective for advertisers to actually introduce humans back into some of these processes and actually assess things themselves, as opposed to defaulting to an AI to make judgments that were actually faulty. And so, the groundwork for our responses was actually to say, well, look, we need to look wider than our own problem definition and solution. There's lots of work that's gone on. The IEEE ethics framework, AI ethics framework, for example, is human rights based. It's an accepted kind of framework that the industry could really look to and use. We need to be opening up our kind of collaboration opportunities, not just to include advertisers, but also to look at civil society and look at how we create more collaborative relationships with affected communities, with organisations working in human rights, because we will get better problem definition and better solutions. We also need culture change and tech investment that backs up the above. Unfortunately, what we did find is areas where legislation is being put into place or regulation has happened, and we've got people trying to work around the problem. Think third-party cookies and organisations defaulting to browser fingerprinting, causing new privacy problems because they're not taking on board the culture change that's needed to do this effectively. Adopt global standards which are ahead of legislation. Again, not playing catch up. We and making mistakes, as we kind of consistently found organisations doing when they were trying to kind of get around the rules. And I think putting all of this in context. So actually reconsidering advertising as a funder of a healthy internet, thinking about where our advertising is going in a kind of systems way, as opposed to just thinking about the advertising itself, because we're causing and we are I suppose we've got, there are rebound effects from some of the decisions that we make that need to be seen in the context of the wider web. So where we got to was a recommendation that actually as a collective, we need to engage with each other and to redesign the system. The recommendations in this report focus on creating mediated forums and relationships between advertisers, platforms, publishers, consumer groups, and digital rights groups. The reason being that each one of those organizations has skin in the game and has a real, and it actually together will create better problem definitions and solutions. And that those forums should essentially kind of focus on 4 things: looking at creating accountability and roadmaps for change, so we're all certain and we all know where we're going and why. To challenge the harms that happen, and like I said, from a holistic perspective. So actually, you know, that if we develop those relationships, it means that when a community becomes affected by a technology, it has the opportunity and the support it needs to raise that issue and with the industry and with other groups, and actually make action happen. To form new initiatives, we've seen over the last kind of 3 years, the number of initiatives that have popped up to solve some of these issues and to create a more proactive approach. We're going to need more as we embed more of these technologies. And finally, to identify unknown unknowns. If you had told me when I started out working in social media in 2009 that Facebook and or Twitter could kind of create some of the issues that we've seen, then I think I would have laughed at you. They were just for sending messages. So we need to be on top of this and actually proactively searching for and taking action on these unknown unknowns that are going to pop up as we embed these new technologies. And again, these forums we think should essentially consider and embed consumer protection and human rights in our decision-making processes, make us proactive, create supply chain accountability. So across as we do with our physical supply chains, so with our digital supply chains, do we have to be vigilant and take action when harms occur? And also think of this in a system. So actually, how do we take action whilst ensuring that our advertising money is not only effective, but also is contributing to a healthy internet? Because a healthy internet will mean that our advertising is more trusted and more effective as well. So this is an example of the organisation. So a lot of this work is based on what we've learned over the Conscious Advertising Network over the last 3 years. We are now at a stage where we're kind of 100 organisations big. Those organisations are everyone from O2 to people like The Body Shop to kind of big advertisers. Then we've got but we've also got kind of civil society members. So everyone from the UN signed up to us. We've got unions, we've got kind of anti-racism charities, etc. And then everyone in the middle. So our advertising intermediaries, large agency groups such as Havas, everyone who's involved in that ecosystem. And the idea is that actually we're all kind of creating those roadmaps, working together to define the problems, define the solutions, and solve some of the issues. And like I said, all of our work involves bringing organisations together. So be that kind of advertisers and civil society groups when there's an issue, be that kind of trade bodies and other issues when we're dealing with systemic issues, together with civil society groups and NGOs from affected communities. And the kind of roadmaps, the areas that we've looked at are things like misinformation, hate speech, diversity, inclusion, and equality. And what we've done is create these what we call manifestos, which are actually our roadmaps for change, which signpost to all the great initiatives that are happening in the advertising industry at the moment, and then filling in the gaps from, like I said, areas like the UN where they have guidelines which are applicable, or or other programs or other pieces of work that help us advertisers get to where we need to be and draw on the experience of other groups in this space. And I just want to, and really, I mean, that's a whistle-stop tour through what is quite a lot of work. So I just want to make sure that you've got an opportunity to ask some questions and kind of interact. But I just wanted to leave you with this statement from one of our interviewees. And she was saying, this isn't just about the web and the technologies as we know it now. As we move towards these new technologies, the harmful practices we see are going to change and kind of increase. And also, as we start to blend our online and offline spaces, as we enter a world of smart cities and the Internet of Things, it's important for us to get this right. And if we do, we will engender trust in the future, and we will make sure that we can continue to use these new technologies in ways which are creative and fantastic and on brand for us.
All right, thank you so much, Harriet. That was fantastic. I think it's a brilliant report. So for anyone who hasn't read the report yet, we really would recommend that you download it and have a good read, because there's a lot of stuff to unpack in there. But this was a really, really great overview. Thank you, Harriet. It's clearly been a huge piece of work and a huge journey that you've been on, uncovering all of these different practices and sort of drawing out these kind of conclusions. And I think that's really valuable for the industry as we move forward on the journey that we've been taking. I mean, just to share a couple of reflections on as WFA, many of you on the call will know we set up a WFA data ethics board about 2 years ago now, I think, and that group has been on a similar journey probably that you have, Harriet, which has been looking at what are the current practices, what are the risks, where does ethics fit into that, where are the gaps currently, and where do we need to go next? And I have to say that journey has been really rich and interesting, but also quite challenging, because there's a lot to unpack in there. And I think we're definitely, we're still on that journey. And I think the more that we can connect with people like you who are really doing amazing work in this space, and networks like the Conscious Act Advertising Network and others, the more that we're going to be able to collectively find some really progressive and interesting solutions to some of the challenges. So with that, I'm going to open for questions. So just if you want to ask a question, you just have to click on the Q&A box at the bottom and type it in there. I can see that we've got a question from Scott. He's asking, Harriet, what are the immediate next steps that you think that we should take internally when many marketers might not know about AI and that impact, and what should we be doing with our agencies?
Like I said, this no one or person is going to have all of the solutions here. Full disclosure, my background is a brand planner. Like I am not an AI expert. I have been on a huge journey with this work, and I think the first thing I would say is get a working group together, find people within your organization who are super technical, find people who are super brand focused, go and talk to your sustainability team, because often they have a lot of this knowledge. And I think, start with your brand values, I think is always the big thing for me. It's like, how are we trying to conduct ourselves in a public space? And then I think have a look at how you are, what technologies you might be using and where you might be using them. And it is, I did take the slide out that had a whole list of where AI might be being used. I think often it's vendor solutions that have a lot of this stuff in. So if you use a social media listening tool, for example, that's probably got AI-based sentiment analysis. And if you've got a brand safety tool, that might have AI in it as well. I think it's about you understanding what is right in terms of what behaviors you would like to embody in that space. I think talking to your vendors about how they are taking steps to ensure that is happening. And then I think once you know that, once you have more information, then you can start to explore kind of roadmaps. I think there's a massive systemic piece, because I think if we just left it all to individual advertisers, that's just so much duplication of work, and that's a lot of a lot of work from a starting point. So I think there's a huge systemic piece where actually with some of these technologies, we as an industry need to start to have a point of view on them. So, I've been to, I've gone from spending a lot of time with advertisers to a lot of time with digital rights groups, and they are a lot of them are furious about the fact that advertisers want to use emotional recognition at all. Because there's huge debates around emotional recognition being used in law enforcement and surveillance. In the report, there's a massive lawsuit that happened between the Sao Paulo Metro and an advertising company who were using emotional recognition. So I think we need a position on this, because otherwise legislators are going to be listening to a very well-formed kind of voice from digital rights groups. And we're going to have to get our stuff together. So I think by bringing those guys into the conversation and having a frank discussion, creating an industry-wide point of view on these technologies, and then also making sure that people are confident that we are doing that harm assessment, I think that backed up by individual action will help.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I mean, you talked about in terms of the individual actions versus the systemic change that many people think are needed. I think that is, we've had a lot of discussions within the data ethics group about this. Is like, where do you start as an advertiser? If you're attending this webinar because you're interested in the topic, and maybe your company's starting to look into data ethics or responsible marketing from a digital perspective, probably the first step is the internal piece, because I think many people would say you've got to make sure you've got your own house in order before you start talking to partners and vendors and asking them if they've got their house in order. But then at the same time, it's a kind of chicken and egg thing, because especially in a market where there are two companies which are very dominant, that probably everybody on this call is working with, what leverage do you have as an individual advertiser to actually be challenging any of the practices that you don't feel meet the standards that your company is setting in terms of data ethics? Because it's one thing saying you need to ask the questions and get the transparency on what they're doing with the data. When you get the answers back, then you have to have that sort of that moment of, okay, well, what if we don't like the answers? What can we do about it? What are we willing to do about it? And I guess that's the question I would have for you, Harriet, is where at some point, a lot of these discussions and the recommendations you're giving to advertisers, at some point that is inevitably going to lead probably us to a moment where the company is going to be faced with potentially needing to change something that they currently do, or a partner they work with, or a type of advertising that they do. What advice do you have for WFA members around how to manage that change? I think changing from the status quo, from a system that seems to work and deliver results, and having to actually make quite a big change and maybe go to someone else internally and say, I don't think we should do this, not because it's not for business purposes, but because I think there's an ethical issue here. How do you manage that? Have you ever talked to anyone who's been through that or given you sort of an insight?
Definitely. Oh my goodness, definitely. So a lot of the conversations that we mediate at the Conscious Advertising Network are between, sometimes they're between members and civil society members. Sometimes they're between, like we do talk to the platforms as well. And I think there's not a lot of malice that goes on. I think often what happens is something works for the measurement criteria that you've set. It's super effective, X, Y, and Z, but it's got these unintended consequences. So I think that's the first thing to recognize, is that very few organizations are, are there being like, we're happy to be totally evil. I think there's human culpability in that. I think that it's really important to understand what you stand for, and that's where I think things like understanding your brand values and how you want to behave, and then understanding, I think human rights is a huge piece of learning for advertisers as well in this space. But as I said, that's super complicated, so it's always something to go and get advice on. And I think it's really worth like putting it in context of, is this how we want to behave? So if this is causing this unintended consequence, then I think if you know what you stand for and you know what your customers expect in terms of in terms of respect, in terms of having their human rights kind of upheld, then I think you're in a strong place to go. And some of the conscious advertising network work helps with that, because we've done a lot of the work around some of the manifestos. It's not AI focused per se, but it can be helpful. And we found that, so really just having that starting point of understanding, of shared understanding, is exactly the place that you want to go to. And I think, for example, the GARM suitability framework and the WFA data ethics work, all of that creates great frameworks as well, which you can take to a vendor and say, this is how we want to behave, and it's not happening. So I think be clear, have something to measure against, ask the right questions. And I think with the large incumbents that you've been talking about, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of consumer demand here. If we're all asking for it and we're all saying, this is what I expect as part of my agreement, and both these companies have really, they do have strong policies and procedures around some of this stuff. So, for example, they may have a hate speech policy which you can take and say, look, they may have and we can start that dialogue. So, yeah, I think it's difficult when you're locked into a system, but I think let's create some consumer demand. We've got the power here. We've got if we're spending cash with these organisations, hopefully they should be considering us customers.
Yes, I think you're right. Although it's, I think I heard Facebook saying the other day that they have 8 million advertisers that they work with. So you wonder the clout of one, but indeed that is an important thing to consider. You mentioned the GARM suitability framework, and there's a question in the chat. And that you've mentioned it actually a couple of times now, and they've asked, could you just elaborate a little bit more on how you think that fits into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, when we asked interviewees what is missing, I think it was about shared definitions and shared understandings of what some of these harms were, what they look like, how you talked about them, because even we found different groups were using different language to describe the same problem. And that just, you can't have a conversation if you can't understand each other. So I think for me, the GARM suitability framework, by creating the definitions and creating that sense of shared understanding of what brand safety looks like, then I think it goes some way into forwarding this conversation. So we don't have to keep having the same conversation again and again and again. We can just say, here it is. And I think that coming back to this idea of collective, I think this relates to the previous question as well. Coming back to this idea of collective action, if we're all asking for the same things, if we're all using the same things, then it moves us all forward. So yeah, and coming back to that front as well, I think if there's issues that are consistent, then we saw, I think we can as organizations also go and say, there's 3 of us and we've all got the same problem, and go and ask those questions of the platforms as well.
Thanks. And that brings me to my next question, I suppose, because obviously as WFA, we were one of the founders of GARM, and we're very, very involved in obviously all that work that's happening. It's being led by my colleague Rob. When you look at a body like WFA, given the fact that WFA has now, I think, over 120 members, all of the biggest global advertisers, and a fantastic network of 60 national advertiser associations around the world as well, what would be your advice to us? Like, what do you think WFA should be doing?
I would love to see you leading the charge on, and I think, given that I keep mentioning your work, you definitely are. But I want to see, I would love to see you actually looking at how you can create those, broker those conversations and widen between, kind of a bit more between, kind of civil society when you're developing your new codes of ethics, or if you're or if you're borrowing from work that's already been done, kind of making sure that you're creating that dialogue, because I think there's a tendency for relationships between, I think, digital rights groups in particular and kind of the advertising community to be quite it's not a kind of there's not a lot of collaborative relationships we found, and I think that there is a role there, because actually there's loads of kind of latent expertise that could be accessed when developing this. So I'd love to see you do that. I think I'd love to see you can keep going with the work that you're doing, and I would and encouraging members to really adopt it and kind of keep going, because I think there's a long way to go if we're collaborative, if we're setting clear definitions, clear expectations, and we do, then also we can stay in front of legislation, and make sure that the industry develops in a way that's means that we don't get the number of shocks that we might have had, that we might otherwise have had.
Yeah, now, and talking of legislation, there's a question in the chat about the European Commission, saying that, as you know, the European Commission, when they came out with their white paper on AI, they listed a number of sort of high risk areas where AI was being used, and they didn't include advertising as one of those uses. So given that context, how do you feel your report has been received in sort of policy circles?
Yeah, actually, I mean, in my response to that consultation, I think I'm not a policy person. This is a new thing for me, but I think it's really important that actually we don't just look at regulating these high risk kind of versions of AI, because if we look at the way that advertising has shaped the development of our online spaces, I think lots of people were quite shocked by the social dilemma, for example, showing how actually our social spaces are there to kind of keep us there. They're there to ensure that advertising reaches us. I think was a bit of a mind shift for people, and actually there's some quite substantial issues with that. If we think about our offline spaces, not all of our offline spaces are commercial, and if they were, I don't think life would be very pleasant for us. So I think that actually we have to. There is a need for us to get ahead and make sure that we're not that actually online spaces, there is some stewardship of the way they develop, for example, and that we are not just all and that we are all a little bit aligned and all planning it a bit better, so that we're not all kind of going, oh great, there's something to be done over here, so let's all jump on it, because that immediately creates issues. So I do think it can't just all be down to us. I think there do need to be some guidelines set which will help us to operate properly, and to do it in a way, like I said, that's not just placing the weight of responsibility solely on the industry. So yes, I think so I wrote back saying I think actually we need something to give us guidelines for how to make this develop, and I think we need to be thinking about the development of the web as a whole, and then advertising to playing a role within that, rather than just looking at advertising on its own. Because, for example, I think the EEC's just suggested that it will suggested a ban on targeted advertising completely. Now, if it does that, it disrupts funding models for content creators, and it creates chaos in other places and probably rebound effects. So, for me, we've got to think about these things systemically.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think, as you say, I think those debates are going to be front and center of a lot of the policy discussions that are going to be happening in Brussels and elsewhere over the next months and probably even years. So this is definitely an area where we're going to be continuing to see a lot of debate evolving, and it's great to hear that you're going to be fully involved in following all of that, and obviously we will as well as advertisers. So with that, I think we are going to close the webinar. So just want to say once again, Harriet, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our members today. I think we have been recording this webinar, so if anybody is interested, we will send around a recording afterwards, and you can share that with your colleagues as well. And thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, Harriet, and thanks, Monica and Gabby, for putting all of this together. Thanks.
Thanks so much.